The Alpha King was cursed never to touch his wife until one night she changed his fate forever. The Northern Kingdoms, a medieval Norse world of stone fortresses, black pine forests, and ice-locked fjords. A world where rank is pressed into the body at birth, and the lowest born are given no name worth keeping. She was born with no name worth keeping, a rejected Omega, the lowest rank in a world that pressed worth into the body at birth. 17 years as a bondservant left her with nothing but calloused hands, sharp eyes, and one secret she had never spoken aloud. A secret that certain powerful men would kill to possess. When a conspiracy reached the walls of her master's estate, shadowed figures, forged documents, a plot to shatter the northern alliances from within, Lena became the one piece no one could afford to leave on the board. Hunted, traded, placed on an auction block in a blizzard, where not a single soul raised a hand to buy her, until he stepped forward from the dark. The Alpha King of Bjornheim, the most feared ruler in the northern kingdoms, set down a single gold coin and said 4 words. "She comes with me." No negotiation, no explanation, no second glance at the crowd. A king who needed nothing, buying the one girl everyone had already thrown away. Why? Follow along to uncover the truth hidden beneath the snow, because nothing in this story is what it seems. The snow had been falling for 3 days without stopping. Lena noticed this the way she noticed most things now, through the narrow slat of the cage, calculating what it meant for survival, rather than feeling anything about it. Cold meant slow blood. Slow blood meant the buyers on the platform below would want to inspect less thoroughly. That was useful. That was something she could use. The auction yard of Stonegate was built into the base of the eastern cliff, open to the sky and sheltered from the wind by nothing but 3 walls of blackened timber. Torches guttered in iron brackets. Around her, a dozen other captives huddled in their cages, some weeping softly, some gone entirely still in that particular way people went still when they had decided nothing mattered anymore. Lena had not gone still. She was watching. She pressed her back against the bars and read the crowd below with the same detached precision she had used to survive 17 years as a bondservant in Lord Harwick's kitchens. Merchants in fox-lined coats, lesser lords with anxious stewards at their elbows, a fur trader from the coast with ice in his beard, and at the back, barely visible through the torchlight and driven snow, a group of figures so motionless they seemed carved from the dark itself. She counted 7 of them. Heavy cloaks. No house markings. The one at their center stood a full head taller than the rest. She looked away before she could be caught looking. Don't draw attention. Don't be interesting. Be the last cage they open. They worked through the cages in order. The girl beside Lena, a northern Omega with braided red hair, sold within 40 seconds. The man after her went for twice the asking price. An older woman who claimed healer's training drew 3 competing bids. Then the auctioneer reached Lena's cage. Rejected Omega. No pack, no lineage, no documented gifts. He read from his ledger without looking up. Lord Harwick's bond girl. 7 years domestic service. No disciplinary marks. A pause. He lowered the ledger and looked at her, then at the crowd, then at his ledger again. Starting bid is opened at... Silence. The fur trader scratched his beard. The merchants consulted each other with sideways glances. One of the lesser lords started to raise his hand, looked at her more carefully through the snow, and put his hand back down. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Starting bid. More silence. Someone in the crowd laughed. A single sound, brief and careless, the kind made by a person who hadn't considered that sounds carried. It landed in her chest like a stone dropped down a well. Lena kept her spine straight. She fixed her gaze on the middle distance, not the crowd, not the auctioneer, not the nearest torch, just the dark air between things. She had practiced this particular kind of looking for years. They cannot have what you do not show them. No interest? The auctioneer shuffled his papers with visible discomfort. Perhaps we return to her later. Open the cage. The voice came from the back. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The crowd simply moved, parted, like water pulling away from a stone dropped into a still surface. Not pushed, just responding to something that displaced the air around it. The tall figure at the center of the dark group stepped forward into the torchlight. She would learn his name the way you learned a storm's name, after it had already arrived. What she knew first was this: he was presence before he was person. The crowd that had laughed 30 seconds ago was entirely silent. The auctioneer made a sound that was not quite a word. The torchlight, which had been guttering in the crosswind, seemed to steady itself in his proximity. He walked toward the platform with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once needed to move faster than he chose to. Black cloak, no house decoration. The hood was down despite the snow, and dark hair was dusted with white where the flakes had caught in it. And he did not brush them away, as if the weather were simply a thing occurring nearby that had no particular relevance to him. His eyes, when they found her cage, were the deep gray of a winter sky 1 hour before full dark. Not black, not silver. That specific, lightless gray that lived between colors and claimed no allegiance to either. The auctioneer descended the platform steps with visible haste. "Your Majesty," the title rippled through the crowd in a cold wave. Several people took an involuntary step back. "We weren't, that is to say, the cage has not yet been fully—" "Open it." 2 words. The auctioneer fumbled for the key, with hands that had stopped working correctly. The cage door swung outward, and the snow swept in where it had been blocked. The cold was immediate and physical, a hand pressing flat against every exposed inch of skin. Lena stood in the opening and looked down at the 8-foot drop to the platform below. She looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then she stepped down onto the iron rung. Then the next. She descended without being helped and without asking, and when her feet hit the platform wood, the impact traveled up through her ankles, her knees, her spine. She straightened. He was 6 feet away. Up close, the gray of his eyes had depth in it, like lake water that went further down than you expected. Fine lines at the corners, not from smiling, she thought, from watching. The jaw beneath was sharp enough to cast its own shadow in the torchlight, and the mouth was set in a line that was not cruel and not kind, and was entirely something else she didn't have a word for yet. She realized she had been reading him the way she read rooms, and made herself stop. "Don't be interesting. You have already failed at that." "What is your name?" he asked. "Lena." A beat. "Of no house." Something moved across his face. If it was recognition, it was gone too quickly to read. "Look at me." She already was. But she understood what he meant. Look fully, without the middle distance trick. And she did. He studied her with an expression that was not inspection. It was something quieter, something she couldn't name, which unsettled her in ways the crowd's silence had not. Then he reached into his cloak and drew out a single coin. Heavy gold, the kind stamped with the Bjornheim wolf sigil. He set it on the auctioneer's ledger without looking at the man. "She comes with me." They rode for 2 days. He gave her a horse of her own. Not a cart, not a seat behind one of his men. A horse. Iron gray, patient, with soft ears that swiveled toward her when she spoke to it in the first quiet hour. The horse had been recently reshod, and its mane freshly combed, as if someone had thought about her comfort before she had arrived to require it. She filed this away and said nothing. The king's guard rode at a respectful distance. The king himself rode at the front, and he did not look back at her. She was aware of him the way you were aware of the sun when you were trying not to look directly at it. Peripherally, constantly, at the edges of every other thing. On the second evening, they stopped at a waypost inn near the frozen river. A guard escorted her to a real room, with a fire already laid and a basin of warm water. On the small table sat a bowl of salted broth, a heel of bread, and a dried fig. She stood in the doorway for a full minute, looking at the fig. She had not eaten one since she was 6 years old, when a shipment arrived from the southern markets, and the cook had given her a bruised one from the bottom of the crate. She could still remember the precise sweetness of it, a warmth that started at the front of the tongue and moved backward, slow as a tide. Someone had known to put a fig there, or had made a careful guess, or had simply been thorough in a way that looked, from the outside, like care. She sat down, ate every bit of the meal, and permitted herself nothing about it. The fortress rose from the cliff as if it had always been there, and the cliff had merely grown up to meet it. Gray stone and black timber, towers with torches at their crowns, a gate twice the height of a mounted rider. The wolf sigil carved in the arch above was large enough that each eye was the size of her closed fist. In the courtyard, a woman in gray wool was waiting. Silver hair pulled severely back, hands folded, eyes that moved over Lena with the efficient clarity of a person who had spent decades sorting problems into manageable categories. "This is Marta," the king said, drawing his horse alongside Lena's. "She will show you to your rooms and answer your questions." He paused. "If you have them." "I have one," Lena said. He waited. "What am I here to do?" The silence that followed was brief, but not empty. Something moved through it. Not discomfort exactly, but the texture of a thing being held carefully in place. "Rest," he said. "For now." He dismounted and walked toward the inner keep without looking back. The snow settled on his shoulders and did not trouble him at all. Marta appeared at Lena's stirrup. "Come, child. In this fortress, his word is the floor beneath your feet." Her rooms were on the western tower's second level. Rooms, plural. A sitting chamber with a fire already burning, a sleeping room with a 4-post bed, and a narrow bathing room with a copper tub. The window looked out over the fjord, black and metallic in the moonlight, its surface studded with early forming ice. Marta showed her the wardrobe, the bell pull, the writing desk, and the 2 books on the shelf. One, a catalogue of northern herbs, worn soft at the spine. One, a collection of old sagas in the ancient Norse script, its pages thumbed at the corners. Then she said goodnight and left. Lena stood in the center of the sitting room for a long time. She was trying to find the shape of what was happening. She was good at shapes, at reading the structure beneath surfaces, at knowing what the arrangement of objects told you about the person who had arranged them. These rooms told her something she didn't know how to classify. The books were not decorative. They were worn with use, clearly read more than once, chosen by someone who had thought about what a person might want to read, rather than what would look appropriate on a shelf. The fire was laid high enough to last through the night. The fur on the bed was dense and warm, the kind meant to actually keep a body alive through northern cold, rather than to signal expenditure. She crossed to the window and pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. Somewhere in the fortress below, she could sense a presence the way you sensed a low sound at the edge of hearing. Not sound exactly, but weight. A particular density in the air. She told herself firmly that it meant nothing. The next morning she found a note slipped under her door. Not a letter, a single sentence on a strip of paper, written in a hand that was precise without being decorative. The handwriting of someone who wrote for function rather than display. "If you wish to read, the library is on the 4th level. It is unlocked." She stood in the doorway holding it for a long moment. The paper was good quality, the everyday kind that appeared in working studies, kept in stacks for notes and calculations. She went back inside, folded it very carefully, and placed it with the other paper she had already begun to collect. Then she stood, with her hands still for a moment, thinking about a man who left library permissions and handwritten notes, and placed books with worn spines on shelves he'd chosen for a woman he hadn't yet spoken to. Thorough, she thought. He is thorough. She went to find the kitchen. She found it on the 3rd level of the inner keep, navigating by smell. The head cook, A broad woman named Sigrun, with forearms like a smith's and the unimpressed gaze of someone who had seen everything, looked up when Lena appeared in the doorway, assessed her in a single sweep, and held out a knife. "If you're going to stand in my kitchen, you'll work," Sigrun said. Lena took the knife. "What needs doing?" She was elbow-deep in a pile of turnips when the king walked through. He was not looking for her. That was clear from the directness of his line through the kitchen toward the cold store. He was almost to the door when he stopped. He turned, not fully, just the angle of his shoulders shifting, his gaze moving sideways until it found her across the kitchen, with an accuracy that suggested he had known precisely where she was before he turned. "You're in the kitchen," he said. "You put me in a fortress with nothing to do," she said. "I found the kitchen." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion that one had once been possible there. "Come to the great hall at sunset. We eat together in this fortress." He disappeared into the cold store before she could ask what "together" meant in a hall of 70 people, where she was none of the things that typically shared a lord's table. She looked down at the turnip in her other hand. She added it to the pile. Together meant one long table, the king at its head, his household arranged by rank and function down its length. And at the far end, not the end that said servant, but not the middle that said equal, somewhere placed with deliberation between the two that said considered, Lena. The meal was served. The king spoke with his advisors about the Eastern coastal agreements. The fire in the great hearth threw warm light across the stone walls, where the wolf sigil was worked in hammered iron, its eyes catching the amber of the flames and throwing it back. She was on her second bowl of stew when she understood that the king's gaze had passed over her twice in the careful way people's eyes moved across something they were making an effort not to linger on. The third time, she was looking back. He did not look away immediately. 3 seconds. Long enough to be a choice rather than an accident. Then one of the advisors said something, and he turned. Lena returned to her stew. Beneath the table, her hand pressed flat against her thigh, feeling the warmth from the bowl above seeping slowly through the cloth of her new dress. "Don't be interesting," she told herself, for what felt like the 100th time since the auction yard. She had already failed at that twice. That night she returned to her rooms late. On the narrow ledge beside her door, something had been placed. A cup, covered with a cloth to hold the heat in. She reached out and touched the side of it. Still warm. Recently placed. 10 minutes, perhaps less. She picked it up and went inside. She sat by the window in the dark and drank it slowly, broth salted and rich, the kind made from long-simmered bones, and watched the snow move across the fjord below in lateral sheets. She told herself very carefully the cups of warm broth left outside doors in the small hours were the gestures of thoughtful household management. Good stewardship, nothing more. She was almost convinced. Almost. The Alliance feast descended on Bjornheim 12 days after Lena did. 200 guests, ships from 3 coastal holds, riders from the mountain territories, a delegation from the far eastern settlements that arrived with smoked whale meat and silver-worked cups, and the particular formal energy of people who had traveled far enough to have opinions about everything they observed. Lena found herself assigned, without explicit discussion but with Marta's clear intention, to household logistics rather than the feast itself. Inventory, sleeping arrangements for 200 guests across a fortress built for 70. The mapping of linen stores against predicted need. She was good at it. She had always been good at systems. She was carrying a stack of linen counts through the upper corridor on the afternoon of the feast when she turned a corner and walked directly into the king. He caught the stack before it fell, both hands moving with a speed that had no business existing in a man his size. One moment she was tipping forward, the next the linens were back in her arms and his hands were at the outer edges of the pile, steadying from outside, while hers were somewhere beneath. If she breathed differently, the topmost sheet would press against his knuckles. She breathed very carefully. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" His hands left the stack, the linen settled.
You're not attending the feast tonight. An observation, not a question.
I'm more useful here.
You've decided that.
Marta confirmed it.
A beat of quiet.
He looked at the stack, then at her face. Wear something other than that tonight. Come to the Great Hall. He walked away before she could explain that she had exactly 2 garments to her name. 2 hours later, Marta appeared in her room, carrying a dress the color of deep winter water. Blue-green, heavy silk, with a silver clasp at the shoulder, worked in the shape of a wave. Marta set it on the bed without ceremony and looked at Lena's expression. "He is a thorough host," Marta said, preemptively. "Don't make it significant." She arrived before most of the guests. Her place at the long table was not where it had been at the household meals. Closer now, third from the head, positioned with a clear line of sight across the table's width to where the king would sit. The guests arrived in a tide of rich cloth and deliberate informality. She recognized the patterns of alliance feasting from years of observing Harwick's gatherings. The careful positioning, the greetings that encoded whole histories in who touched whose arm and at what angle. The laughter that was a form of negotiation. The king entered last, flanked by his advisors and the Eastern delegation. He wore formal dark clothing, the wolf sigil at his collar in hammered silver. He moved through the room with that particular quality she had begun to associate with him. Unhurried, the crowd adjusting its current around him, the way a river adjusted around stone. He did not look for her. The absence of it moved through her chest like a draft from an open window. She picked up her cup, took a slow sip of mead, and returned to reading the room. The noble ladies seated at the lower end of the table spoke the way people spoke when they had decided someone nearby fell below the threshold of consideration. Rejected Omega, no name, no lineage. What a waste of a throne. If he wanted to collect strays, there are cheaper ways. Lena turned her wine cup slowly in her fingers. The stem was smooth and cool. She focused on the smoothness of it, the specific weight of the metal. She set the cup down with great precision. She ate her bread. A man introduced himself as Leifer of the Eastern Alliance. Easy smile, genuinely warm eyes. The kind of warmth that came from having grown up comfortable enough to afford real pleasantness. He sat down beside her and leaned his elbows on the table. "You've been watching this room like it owes you something," he said. "Who are you?" "Lena, of no house." He looked at her with frank curiosity rather than the careful avoidance she had become accustomed to. "You see everything from where you're sitting. I noticed you rereading the Eastern delegation's seating arrangement 15 minutes ago and changing your interpretation of something. It's what I do when I'm in rooms I don't fully understand yet." "A useful habit." He smiled. "Dance with me when they play the floor music. I think you'd be extraordinary at it, and I think this feast owes you something enjoyable." She looked at him. She looked, without meaning to, across the width of the table to where the king stood in conversation with a mountain territory lord. His back was to her. "All right," she said. She was good at it. She had known this for years in the theoretical sense. A healer at Harwick's house had taught her the northern floor dances when she was 12, trading lessons for kitchen help. But she had never had occasion to discover whether knowing and doing were the same thing. When she stepped onto the floor and the music found her, she learned that for her, at least, they were. The music was 3/4 time, harpa and hand drum, and it had a quality that moved through a body rather than past it. She found the pattern quickly, let her feet remember what her mind had catalogued, and moved. The great hall was watching. She was aware of this the way she was aware of most things, as information, not as performance. She did not dance for the watching. She danced because her body had found something it recognized, and her mind, for the first time in weeks, went briefly quiet. She turned at the end of a phrase and found the king's eyes from across the room. He had stopped speaking. He had stopped moving. He stood at the far end of the table with one hand resting on its surface, and his entire attention concentrated in a single direction. And that direction was her. His gaze was not diplomatic. It was not social. It was the specific, focused quality of a man watching something he had been trying not to watch for considerably longer than tonight. The dance step carried her away. She faced forward. Her pulse was doing something with no practical application. The music moved into its slower passage, and Leifer leaned slightly closer. A woman like you, with the mind you clearly have, sitting at the edge of a feast that doesn't know what it has. He looked at her steadily. I have my own hall in the Eastern Territories. A good hall, warm, well-run. No wife. I could make arrangements that would give you something better than whatever this is. The music stopped, not because of what he said, because of the hand that closed on his shoulder. The hand was not violent. It was the deliberate resting of an enormous and entirely controlled force, the kind that communicated its full weight through the careful restraint of how little of it was presently being applied. The music around them faltered, then died altogether. The musicians reading the room with the professional instinct of people who had learned that when the king went still, the sound should too. The great hall held its breath. The king's hand rested on Leifer's shoulder, and the king did not look at Leifer. He looked at Lena. His eyes were gray and direct and carrying nothing diplomatic in them at all. Ambassador, he said, in a voice that was perfectly composed and absolutely final. A word about the Eastern trade terms. Now. Leifer went without protest. Quickly, with the self-possession of a man who understood the distinction between a negotiation he had lost and a danger he had avoided, and was grateful it was only the former. Lena stood on the cleared circle of the dance floor, while the rest of the hall began cautiously finding its previous rhythms. The king stood before her. Up close, in the layered warmth of the great hall's torchlight, she saw something she hadn't caught in other lights. His eyes were not simply gray. In the very center of each, faint as a ring on still water, was the suggestion of amber. Not present, not fully, but there beneath the surface, the way color lived in winter ice, visible only at the right angle. It lasted one breath. Then it was gray again, clear and steady. Dance with me, he said. It was not a request. It was not quite a command. It existed in some unmarked territory between the two that she didn't have a category for yet. She put her hand in his. His hand was warm, the specific, precise warmth of it making her aware that her fingers were cold, and that the temperature differential existed at every point where skin met skin. His palm was calloused at the base, smooth higher up, and the warmth had a depth to it that she felt settle slowly up through her wrist. He led without pressure, the way a current led. She could feel the direction without being pushed toward it. They moved through the floor pattern, and he did not look at the room. He looked at her, with the particular steadiness she had been cataloging since the auction yard. Not inspection, not possession, but the quality of attention a person gave to something that had become important without their full permission. What did he offer you? The king's voice was low, calibrated for only her ears. His hall. A title by marriage. She kept her own voice level. He was being kind, I think. He saw someone who looked badly placed. You have been badly placed. She looked up at him. And yet you placed me. The hand at the small of her back shifted, barely perceptible, a fraction of an inch, and then steadied. The adjustment was so small it could have been nothing. She suspected it was not nothing. Not forever, he said. She could not tell whether that was a reassurance or a warning, or both wearing the same coat. He walked her off the floor and released her hand with the careful precision of someone setting down a thing they were conscious of the weight of. Go back to your table. Eat something. She went. She picked up her cup and did not drink from it, and looked at the amber settled in the bottom. Across the hall, she watched him move back into the work of the feast, the conversations, the strategic pleasantness, the contained diplomacy of a man who had 7 borders to manage, and one composed face with which to manage them all. She watched the line of his profile, and the way he held his hands when he was listening carefully, very still, like a man who had learned that stillness was its own kind of power. There are 7 years of something behind those eyes, she thought. I don't know what they are. I want to know what they are. She took a breath. Don't, she told herself. She drank the mead. The feast ended. The guests departed. The fortress settled back into its winter rhythms. The daily accounting of stores, the patrol rotations, the particular quiet of a large household that had exhaled. The king's door stayed closed. Not to everyone. Lena could hear his advisors going in and out throughout the days, the steady administrative work of a kingdom in cold season. But every time she found herself in a corridor he also occupied, his trajectory adjusted before she could determine whether the adjustment was intentional. He left rooms she entered. He arrived in corridors she had just left. The pattern was too consistent to be accident, and too careful to be carelessness. She told herself she was not noticing this. She was cataloging it, which was different. She found Marta in the supply room, counting bolts of winter cloth with the focused serenity of a woman who found inventory genuinely restorative. "He's avoiding me," Lena said. Marta did not look up. "That is a strong word. He changes his route when he sees me in a corridor. He leaves whatever room I enter within 3 minutes." She waited until the older woman looked up. "I'm not asking you to explain him. I'm asking whether I've done something wrong." Marta set down her measuring cloth. She looked at Lena with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite admiration, and occupied some precise territory between them. "You have not done anything wrong," she said. "You have done something that is genuinely difficult to explain, without more information than I am in a position to provide. It does not mean what you are afraid it means." "What does it mean, then?" "Ask him," Marta said. She found Sigrun in the kitchen that evening and worked alongside her for an hour. The familiar rhythms of chopping and stirring, the smell of wood smoke and rendered fat. While her hands worked, she let herself think. There had been a girl in Harwick's kitchen when Lena was 9, older, quicker, who had taught her the first truly useful thing she'd ever been taught. The story you tell yourself about why things are happening is almost always wrong. But it's the story you act on anyway, so choose it carefully. She had chosen, for 17 years, the story that said, "You are of no account. Do not make yourself visible. Do not want specific things." The problem was that this story had been keeping her useful at the cost of keeping her absent, and she was no longer entirely convinced that was a trade worth continuing to make. She set the knife down, looked at the pile of vegetables she had produced. She went to find the king. She found him, not in his formal chambers, but in a smaller room off the east corridor. A working study, with maps tacked to the stone walls, shelves of ledgers, a fire burned down to deep red coals. He was standing at the window with his back to the room, which was the position she was beginning to associate with him when he was thinking through something difficult. She knocked on the open door. He turned. He was in plain clothes, no formal tunic, no silver clasp. A linen shirt unlaced at the throat, sleeves pushed to the elbows. She had not seen this version of him before. The formal attire had served as a kind of structure, she realized. A deliberate architecture that organized what she looked at and kept certain things behind it. Without it, there was just the length of him, the specific proportion of shoulder to jaw, and the gray of his eyes in coal light, which was different from the gray in torchlight, and different again from the gray in full winter daylight. She was becoming very familiar with the particular grays of his eyes. This was a fact she declined to examine. "Lena," he said, just her name, in a way that suggested he had been expecting her and had not expected to be expecting her, both at once. "Why do you leave when I enter a room?" The question came out cleaner than she'd planned. No careful softening, no apology folded around it. He was quiet for 7 full beats of the fire's settling. "I am being careful," he said. Of what? Of several things.
That's not an answer.
No. His gaze was direct, undefended. It's not. She kept her posture deliberately even. You bought me at an auction where no one else would bid. You gave me rooms and a horse and books and warm broth left outside my door at midnight. She stopped herself from going further. I don't know what this is. I need to know what this is. He turned back toward the window for a moment. His hand rested on the stone frame, a brief, grounding gesture. Then he turned back fully. Do you know what it means, he said slowly, to carry a wolf's instinct in the blood? Not as metaphor. As a fact of the body. She waited. There is something in my line, he said. Old. Concentrated in a way it isn't in most. It cannot be argued with or reasoned away. It recognizes things. People. Specific people. The coal broke and resettled in the grate. She said nothing. She was listening the way she listened when she was filing everything. He was quiet for long enough that she began to understand it wasn't reluctance. It was the particular difficulty of a person trying to make something internal legible in external language. The first time I saw you, he said eventually, on the auction platform, the instinct recognized something. Completely, without argument or gradation. He looked at his hands. In 34 years, with every person I have ever encountered, it has never done that before. She sat with this. That's why you bought me, she said. Yes, not calculation, not charity, he said. Never charity. But you've kept the distance. Because the bond, what the instinct recognizes, does not mean the person on the other side of it has chosen anything. He met her eyes with a directness that was completely free of performance. You had been given no choices for 17 years. I would not remove the next one. The fire threw its red light across the maps on the wall, the fjords and territories and coastlines of a kingdom. She looked at them for a moment, then back at him. What do you want? She asked. Not what you're protecting me from. What do you actually want? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. I want every day of the rest of my life to have you in it, he said. That is what I want. And I would give the same care to that as I give to every other thing in this fortress, if you gave me the opportunity. She stood in the firelit room with the cold stone at her back and let those words settle exactly where they had landed. Then stop closing doors, she said. She found it the next morning, on the small table just inside her door. A piece of carved bone, small enough to close a fist around, the size and shape of something made to be carried, worn smooth at the edges from handling. Runic inscription cut into its face in lines so fine they looked like the work of many patient hours. She brought it to Runa, the fortress healer, a sharp-eyed woman who worked in the herb room off the courtyard. Runa held it up to the window light, turned it, set it down. Protection charm, old work. The binding technique predates the current kingdoms by at least 2 centuries. She tapped the smallest mark at the charm's edge. The inscription is not a general protection. This rune here, her finger traced a tiny angular symbol at the center, is a personal name, cut into the binding's core. The traditional placement for a charm, made for one specific person. She handed it back. Keep this somewhere safe, and ask whoever gave it to you what name is written there. She found him alone in the yard that afternoon, working through sword forms in the cold air. She stood at the yard's edge and watched without announcing herself. He moved through the patterns with an economy of motion that had taken a long time to become that natural. No wasted angle, no hesitation. The kind of precision that lived below thought. His breath came in short, controlled plumes. The sky above was the flat white of a midwinter afternoon. He finished the final form, lowered the practice sword, and turned. The charm, she said. Yes. Runa says there's a name in the center binding. She held it out. She wouldn't tell me whose.
He crossed the yard and took the charm from her hand, taking the object, not her hand, but the transfer required a moment of contact. The edge of his fingers against her palm, brief and precise, and the warmth of it traveled from that point up through her wrist with a specificity that left her aware of every nerve in that part of her hand for a full minute afterward. He turned the charm and looked at the inscription. "It's your name," he said. The yard was very quiet. The cold air pressed clean and sharp against her face. "You carved my name into a protection charm," she said, "before you arrived." He said it without emphasis, as if this required no particular explanation. "You didn't know me before I arrived." "No." He held the charm back out to her. "I knew what had been done with you, what you had survived. Some things don't require introduction." His eyes stayed on hers. "Some things are already known." She took the charm back. Her fingers closed around it, feeling the fine cuts of the inscription against her palm. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He nodded once, retrieved his practice sword, and returned to his forms. She stood at the yard's edge for a moment longer than was necessary, watching the economy of his movement, the cold air between them carrying the clean smell of snow and exertion, and then she turned and went back inside. The charm was in her inner coat pocket, against her ribs, where it could hold her warmth, and she could feel it when she breathed. Over the following week, without announcement, the closed doors simply stopped closing. Not dramatically. There was no moment. There was instead a gradual rearrangement of pattern. A second chair by the study fire, where she was now welcome to read. An additional setting at the small evening table. The habit he had developed of walking the western parapet in the early mornings that aligned, without either of them having discussed it, with her own new habit of being there at the same hour. They talked about the kingdom, the supply routes and coastal raids, and the political mathematics of 3 competing alliance structures. He listened to her analysis with genuine attention, not the performative attention of a man being polite to a subordinate, but the focused, engaged quality of someone who found the thinking useful and wanted more of it. One morning, looking out over the fjord, he said, "You restructured Harwick's winter supply chain in your 4th year there." She was quiet. He attributed it to a new steward. The new steward didn't exist. I verified it before the auction. He looked at her sidelong, in the way he sometimes looked at her when he was being careful about how much he revealed. "I am thorough." She looked at the fjord. She thought about figs placed on small tables, horses freshly shod, books worn at the spine, a name carved in bone. He has been thorough about me for longer than I knew, she thought. She did not say this, but the thought was warm, and she carried it inside through the rest of the morning like a coal in cupped hands. That night she was in the library, 4th level, unlocked, as the note had said, reading by firelight with the herb catalog open in her lap, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She went still. The footsteps were his. She had learned to recognize them in the past weeks without meaning to. A particular quality of pace, deliberate and even, that she could now distinguish from every other set of footsteps in the fortress. They stopped outside the library door. She sat very still. The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the fortress's upper passages with a sound like breath. 2 minutes passed. Maybe 3. The footsteps continued on. She returned to the herb catalog. She read the same entry 4 times. Meadowsweet for fever. Meadowsweet for fever. Meadowsweet for fever. Stop, she told herself. She turned the page. She was already at the wall when he arrived the next morning, the sky beginning to crack its cold gray open above the eastern ridge. She had her hands wrapped around a cup of barley tea, watching the fjord below where the surface ice caught the first pale light and threw it back in long, fractured lines. She heard him before she saw him, those footsteps, the unhurried cadence of them, and did not turn around. He came to stand beside her at the wall, not touching. The distance between them was the particular distance of people who had both calculated it without admitting to the calculation. For a time, neither of them spoke. This was a new thing between them, the silence that didn't require filling. It had arrived, like most of the things between them, without announcement or discussion, and she had filed it alongside the warm broth and the fig and the carved bone and all the other items in the inventory she was keeping, without knowing yet what she was counting toward. "I used to stand here alone," he said eventually, "before you were here." She looked at him sideways. "And now?" "Now I find I cannot remember what I was watching for." His gaze was on the fjord, but the quality of his attention had shifted. She had learned to read this, the slight change in stillness that meant he was somewhere near the edge of something he was choosing carefully. "Or perhaps I can, and I find I am no longer watching for it." The light changed. A seam of pale gold opened above the ridge and spread across the water below, turning the ice from gray to amber, slow and full, the way warmth moved through something it was committed to keeping. She turned her face toward it. Beside her, she felt him turn also. Their shoulders were not touching. The space between them held the cold morning air and the smell of snow on stone, and something else, the particular charged quality of a distance that both of them were choosing not to close, and both of them were choosing not to widen, and that existed, therefore, as a kind of decision all its own. "Lena," he said. Her name again, in that way of his, as if it were not just a name, but a question he had not yet finished asking. She looked at him. His eyes in this light were not the gray of torchlight or coal glow. They were the gray of the sky just before the color came in, that suspended, held moment between dark and morning, between one state and the next. And in their center, very faint, the suggestion of amber that she had seen once before in the feast firelight and not been able to stop thinking about since. "I know," she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, the careful architecture of it shifting, briefly, the way a structure shifts when the weight it has been compensating for is finally acknowledged. "You know," he said. "I have been cataloging you since the auction yard," she said. "I am very thorough also." One breath. Two. Then something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the suggestion of a smile, not the near possibility of one, but an actual, real, unguarded thing, small and certain as a flame catching in dry wood. It crossed his face in the space of a second, and left behind a stillness that was different from all the other kinds of stillness she had learned to read in him. Warmer, less armored. He reached out, with the same deliberate precision he brought to everything, and covered her hand on the parapet wall with his own. Not pressing, not gripping, just placed there, present. She looked down at their hands in the new morning light, his larger one over hers, both of them cold from the air and becoming, by degrees, less so. She turned her hand over beneath his, slowly, and let her fingers close around his palm. Below, the fjord went on in its amber morning, ice cracking at the edges, the water dark and deep and patient as something that had always known it would eventually be free. She thought, this is what thorough looks like. Not grand gestures, not declarations, figs on small tables. Names carved in bone. A hand placed carefully over another in the cold morning light, at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right weight. She thought, I have been given no choices for 17 years. She thought, I choose this. She did not say any of it. She did not need to. He had told her once that some things were already known, already legible, already present, requiring only the patience to wait until both hands found each other in the cold. She stood at the parapet wall with the Wolf King of the northern fortresses, while the fjord below her turned gold, and the fortress breathed its slow winter breath around them both, and she let herself be, for the first time in longer than she could count, entirely present in the place where she was standing. Don't be interesting, she had told herself, that first day on the auction block, in the driving snow, with the crowd's silence pressing against her like a held breath. She had failed at that spectacularly. And it turned out, she thought, feeling the warmth of his hand moving slowly into hers, that failing at that particular thing was the beginning of everything worth surviving for. She never asked to be saved. She never expected to be seen. For 17 years, Lena survived by making herself small, invisible, useful, unremarkable. She learned that wanting things was dangerous. That hope was a luxury the lowest born couldn't afford. She built walls not out of pride, but out of necessity, brick by quiet brick, until she forgot there was ever anything worth protecting inside them. And then a king stepped out of the dark and bought her, not because she was valuable to the world, but because something ancient and unargued in his blood recognized her before his mind could form a reason. This story isn't really about auctions or kingdoms or wolves in the blood. It's about what happens when someone who has spent a lifetime being told they are not enough is finally, carefully, consistently shown otherwise. Not through grand declarations, not through rescue, but through a fig left on a small table, a horse freshly shod, a name carved in bone, a hand placed over another in the cold morning light, with exactly the right weight, at exactly the right time. The greatest act of love, sometimes, is simply paying attention to someone the world has chosen to overlook. And the greatest act of courage? Letting yourself believe it's real. If this story touched something in you, drop a comment and tell me, which moment hit you the hardest? The auction block? The rune charm? Or that quiet morning on the parapet? I genuinely want to know. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that sneak up on you and stay, hit like and subscribe. Every single one of your comments gives me the fuel to keep creating. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.